So as you can see, we've already got our PEs in Hong Kong and Frankfurt set up on our portal. The underlay has already been completely configured. You can also notice that you can't actually connect to Frankfurt directly from Hong Kong. We go through Taiwan, but that shouldn't matter too much in the setup process. So without further ado, let's begin. First, we need to create our project. So in order to do that, we come to the sidebar and we click on the Projects button. Now we've been redirected to the Projects page. Firstly, we need to create the project. So that can be done over here. Let's define our project name. We set the domain as example.com. And let's call this the example company. And just like that, you can see that this project has been created. Now, here's something to note. Each project can have multiple PEs and access interfaces. Different projects can contain the same PEs and have the same connections. However, each project creates a separate network, so it's okay. Now let's move on to making our interfaces. So let's go to the Elements page and select Overlay and Manage Overlay. Here we go. We have all the components necessary to create the overlay. So we start with the access interface. As you can notice here, there are already 2 projects created with the Frankfurt and HKPEs already registered. Now, as mentioned before, this doesn't matter since each new project will create a new network. So let's add our access interfaces. Firstly, we select our PE. Let's make the Hong Kong one first. Then we select the new project we've just created, so example.com. As you can see, the PE and project interface have already been created. Now, let's create the Frankfurt interface. As you can see, both interfaces have been successfully created and registered to the example.com project. Now, let's enable their smart functions so we can customize these interfaces. We come to the Smart Function tab, and we see both of these interfaces have already been registered. So let's enable them both. We just click on the Smart Function toggle, and it will be turned on. It takes a little while because commands are being sent to the controller. We do the same thing for Frankfurt. Great, now both smart functions have been enabled. Now we can start customizing our access interface. Let's go back to the Access Interface tab. Let's select the Hong Kong PE interface and customize the DHCP. Now, as you can see, we've defined the IP range here and here. This will assign the customer an IP between 10 and 200. Now, the DHCP lease limit is a very interesting feature. If the customer disconnects from the interface and reconnects within the time range specified here, which is 70 to 100 seconds or 2 hours in this case, they will be assigned the same IP as before. Now, you can further customize the DHCP, but for our current purposes, it isn't really necessary. So let's move on and repeat the same thing for Frankfurt. Great. Now let's move on and add the net gateway, basically assigning the IP address to the access interface. Let's do the same thing for Frankfurt. Great. Now that that's done, let's add the push static routing to each interface. So now, if you want to connect to this IP range in the Frankfurt network, then you need to point to this IP here. If you have more routes, you can add them here as well. Now let's do the same for Frankfurt. Great. Now let's configure the access port and bus. So we change the tabs appropriately. And here we go. We have a list of all the ports that have already been configured. But what we need to do is create a new access port and bus. We have already defined the IP addresses. The net mask will be 24. The access port and bus are both created at the same time, so we don't need to create them individually. Now that that's done, let's do the same thing for the Frankfurt PE. Excellent. Now both interfaces have an access port and bus. Now that the infrastructure has been set up, we need to add users with passwords that can gain access to the network. Let's do this now. Let's come to the Access Users tab. We create Access User, and we first select the PE we'd like to create. Let's make the Hong Kong one first. Let's call this Test User. Now we can also add the user group, real name, and note, but we won't do that for now. And we've started the process of creating the user and assigning the password. Both have completed successfully. Let's do the same thing for the Frankfurt PE. You may have also noticed that you can set the bandwidth limits for each user. That can easily be done by going to the Operations panel by clicking the Settings button here and clicking Bandwidth Throttling. So here you can change it from unlimited to whatever kind of cap you want. As you can see, you can set it to 460, but minimum is 10. So let's not change that for now. Let's leave it at unlimited. Now, finally, we need to go to the VRF tab to create some virtual route forwarding. In order for different customers to connect to the same PEs, we need to separate the networks with the virtual route forwarding, much like in MPLS. Now let's create a VRF for each PE and project. We first select the PE, in this case, the Hong Kong. Great, now let's add one more for Frankfurt. Excellent. Now we need to bind the VRF to the previously created access ports. In order to do that, we must first check the access port and bus to make sure we have the right ID. So here, the Frankfurt port would be tap 20 and the Hong Kong port would be tap 19. So let's keep that in mind and go back to virtual route forwarding. This was for the Frankfurt PE, so we'll assign the Frankfurt tap here. Let's do the same thing for the Hong Kong PE. Excellent. Now our final step is to broadcast the VRF into other networks and PEs that act as middlemen to transport the packets. Now we select our PE. In this case, we'll do Frankfurt first. Oh, and we need to. And the corresponding VRF ID. The VRF ID can be obtained by looking back on the VRF obtained in the previous step. Excellent. Excellent. Let's do the same thing for Hong Kong. Great. Now with the last step completed, our overlay infrastructure has been established. As you can see, in these last few videos, we've successfully created this entire network. And in this video, we've set up the access interfaces according to these IPs and the access port. So any CPE or VPN client can easily connect to our PEs.